Put us in a box. Go ahead. That just gives us something to break out of. Because the next generation 2025 GMC Terrain Elevation is raising the standard of what comes standard. As far as expectations go, why meet them when you can shatter them? What we choose to challenge, we challenge completely. We are professional grade. Visit GMC.com to learn more.
Summer's here, and Nordstrom has everything you need for your best dress season ever. From beach days and weddings to weekend getaways and your everyday wardrobe. Discover stylish options under $100 from tons of your favorite brands like Mango, Skims, Princess Polly, and Madewell. It's easy, too, with free shipping and free returns, in-store order pickup, and more. Shop today in stores, online at Nordstrom.com, or download the Nordstrom app.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 551, interview with Tim Bouverie about his new book, Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World. Mr. Bouverie, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ray. It's a great pleasure.
So as I tell my daughters, who never ask, but I tell them constantly that the world that they live in now is very much shaped by not only the war itself, but how the war ended. And so when I saw your book, I'm like, I have to get this guy on because it's pretty much the relationship between the big three, other players as well. And again, it's just something that needs to be covered because you can only study World War II for so much. You know, the number of tanks, the number of troops before, what should we learn from this? What should we take away? What were some more, in between the battles? And so that's why, one of the reasons why I enjoyed your book very much. So I'll just jump into the questions here. So you start your book giving some statistics. The Allies, the eventual Allies had more people, they had more money, they had a larger industrial base. But that doesn't mean they're automatically going to get along, that everything's going to be okay. There's a certain amount of distrust, the different ideologies, and obviously the post-war aims. And so I was reminded when I was reading your book that we have to remember this is not inevitable. This is not locked in. It was a very dynamic, fluid, like any other relationship. And these gentlemen and others had to work very hard, given all of the distrust, to work together, to remember the common cause. But at the same time, at the end of the day, everybody has their own agenda. And they had to figure out a way to balance all of that out during a world war.
That's completely true. I mean, I think I use the phrase about the Grand Alliance, that is the main alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, as improbable and incongruous. And it really was, because at the start of the war, Britain and France are at war, but the United States is proclaiming US neutrality. That is supported by an overwhelming preponderance of the US population, while Stalin is allied with Hitler, dividing Eastern Europe up for the benefit of the totalitarians. And it's only because, frankly, the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor and Hitler invaded the Soviet Union that this alliance came about. Britain and America had been moving much closer together, and America had been giving Britain a huge amount of economic and material help before December of 1941. But I think there was absolutely nothing inevitable about this coalition coming together.
Right. And again, there are many historians are going, and they did at the time, going, why did Hitler attack Soviet Russia? I mean, it just set up a two-front war. It set up, like you said, the big three. So again, it's those moves, it's those mistakes that some people made that made this possible. So if I could jump into early in the war, you cover the Norwegian fiasco. You cover things like the pre-war failed diplomacy of the Munich Agreement. So then comes the Battle of France. You've got the British Navy, you've got the French Army. They should be able to give a good account of themselves. However, obviously it doesn't go that way. The War of France is roughly over in 6 weeks. And I just wanted to ask you, for someone who's generally new to this, why was the war over so quickly in France, and how, and I'm just trying to imagine the shock of the British going, what in the heck do we do now? Because that was the game plan. Their army, our navy, we're going to be able to contain them. And now that coalition is no more.
Well, you're completely right to say it was a major shock. We're so used to the idea that France did collapse in 6 weeks that we sort of assumed that that was always going to happen. But of course it wasn't. The French army was the second largest in the world. Only the Red Army, that is the Soviet army, was larger than the French army. And it was the Anglo-French combination that had held the Germans for 4 years on the Western Front during the Great War, the First World War. So the idea that this great army could collapse in 6 weeks is completely unconscionable and comes as a profound shock. Why did it happen? Mainly military reasons. The French expected the Germans to repeat the tactic that they had and strategy that they had deployed in the First World War and invade France through the Low Countries, that is to say, through Belgium and Holland. This the Germans did begin to do on the 10th of May, and the cream of the French army and the British Expeditionary Force charged into Belgium to help defend Belgium. But this was not the focus of the German attack. The focus of the German attack was further south. The major attack was Major General von Rundstedt's Panzer Army, which was making its way through the supposedly impenetrable forest of the Ardennes. And once they'd broken through the French line there, the British and the French found it impossible to counterattack. They were unable to consolidate their forces. There was no strategic reserve behind the French lines to plug the gap, as it happened in the Great War, and French morale collapsed. I mean, that comes in, this is the other element of it. There is a political element to the collapse of France. But France is traumatized by the First World War. It had been fought on their soil. It had bled them white. It had led to devastating psychological as well as material scars on both the French people and the French landscape. And French politics in the 1930s was extremely febrile and dysfunctional. There were 11 governments between 1933 and 1939. The average life of a government in France was 4 months. There was, as we know, a civil war in Spain, but many people thought there could be a civil war in France, as the French were hugely divided between communists, socialists, centrists, royalists, fascists. The only thing most people in France agreed on in the 1930s was their distaste for war, and the onset of defeatism within the French government and the French high command so swiftly after the Battle of Sedan, where the Germans broke through the French line, I think is expressive of the fact that France had been so traumatized by 1914 to 18 and had been in such political turmoil ever since.
Right. A very complex situation. And I'm glad you put it the way you did, because it was a military victory for the Germans. I mean, they used what happened in the Great War. They did the feint. They came around. It was tactically brilliant, and it worked for them. And then you factor in everything else you just said. It's almost like, how could that not happen? But credit where credit is due. But what was important to me when I was reading this part of your book is this sets up the rest of the book. The Britain or London was like, okay, we have an ally. That ally is gone. Now we have to look around for other allies, because with all due respect, Britain is not yet ready to defeat Germany all on its own. It needs allies, because that's what you do in a war. So, but before we leave the French, and again, this is just something that it just impresses me about the British. So the British react to the French defeat. They're shocked, and yet they have to go on. Yes, you can be shocked, but events don't stop. So there's the British attack. There's the British decision to attack the French fleet to absolutely make sure it does not get into German hands, because that would be a catastrophe of the first order. So if you could describe a little bit for us, maybe the British mentality behind that, but also, was it an indication, I guess, to America, to other places, like even though we're right now outgunned, we are very sincere in taking on and hopefully one day defeating the Third Reich.
So you're completely right. Britain could not win the Second World War without allies, and Britain didn't win the Second World War without allies. What Britain could and what Britain did do was to deny Hitler victory by preventing the Germans from winning after the Battle of France, by defying Hitler. Hitler expected Britain to make peace because there was no way Britain could win. There was no way Britain that could reinvade the continent on her own after the fall of France. And there was no strategy for winning the war in 1940. There was only a strategy for surviving. The most that Churchill came up with for a strategy for winning the war, he told his son, was to drag in the United States.
Right.
But US help to the British was pretty meager in most of 1940, and one of the reasons for this was that the Americans, like most of the rest of the world, thought that Britain was going to capitulate, thought that Britain too would surrender, like the French did. And so part of the motivation for sinking the French fleet, which the British do, it's a really tough decision, this is firing on a friendly navy, a navy that had been allied to your navy but 2 weeks earlier. It's an action which results in the deaths of 1,300 French sailors. And it's justified because the French navy is the fourth largest in the world. The British are expecting the Germans to try and invade the British Isles. And if the Germans can get hold of the French navy, then that somehow becomes a much greater likelihood and a more feasible proposition. But at the same time, the British are desperate to show the world that they are going to carry on no matter what. They will do anything. They will even fire on their former allies to survive. And it was an act which created a great deal of excitement in the rest of the world. It impressed people, including in the United States. And part of the research which I did, which I don't believe anyone else had discovered before, is that the British government actually asked the Roosevelt administration, the British ambassador asked FDR his permission before the British shelled the French fleet.
On one hand, that's, showing respect for a potential ally, but going back to what you said about Churchill, I mean, any conversations that Churchill can have with FDR about the war, slowly, just kind of making him a part of the conversation, is utterly brilliant and yet subtle on Churchill's part. Speaking of the U.S., obviously, London has its sights on Washington. FDR is certainly sympathetic to the British cause, but it is an election year. At least 50% of America is isolationist, and there's a lot of mistrust between the two countries because of different types of government. America's military is quite small at the time. There's a lot of neutrality laws on the books tying FDR's hand, but you can just see, I think the word is wooing that Churchill used. Churchill woos FDR with their conversations. But if you could maybe describe some of the early parts of the relationship between the two countries, between the two leaders, and like you were saying a couple of minutes ago, at first in 1940s, it's not like the United States was sending a ton of aid for those various reasons to London, who desperately needed it.
Sure. Well, I think we have to de-romanticize the Anglo-American relationship, and we have to demythologize it, because Churchill did a lot to mythologize it, both in his letters to FDR at the time, who, as you say, he was wooing, but also in his post-war memoirs. Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, the very day the Battle of France began. Predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, didn't even want America to fight on the side of Britain and France.
Wow.
And that was because the British were highly aware that if America fought, then America would be in at the peace conference. And if America was in at the peace conference, she was going to demand major changes to the world, which would include, they were fairly certain, structural changes to the British Empire, which would undermine its coherence, undermine its viability. In particular, the system of tariffs, which in those days protected the British Empire. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was the British that were pro-tariffs, and it was the Americans who were very anti-tariffs.
Right.
So there was that going on. As soon as the Battle of France begins, the British swiftly move to the conclusion that their only chance of winning the war is through unlimited American aid. Churchill commissions a report in late May of 1940 by the Chiefs of Staff asking whether or not Britain can survive. And the Chiefs of Staff conclude that Britain can survive, may even win the war, but that it is dependent upon unlimited resources flowing across the Atlantic from the US, and possibly, they say, active participation by the US on the side of the British. This is a long way off. Churchill makes a specific request of FDR in the summer of 1940. He demands that Roosevelt give him 50 of the United States' First World War era destroyers, so that the British can take away their destroyers from Atlantic convoy duty and put them into the Channel, thereby guarding the British Isles against invasion. FDR refuses.
Wow.
And it is a massive propaganda exercise on behalf of the British. The British embassy in Washington leaks the fact that this has been asked of the US. That generates a lot of sympathy for Britain. There are a lot of people in America, particularly on the East Coast, influential people, and surprisingly for me when I was doing this research, also in the South, in the former seceded states, that support all aids to Britain. And eventually this deal for destroyers comes into being, but the British have to pay dearly for it. In return for these 50 destroyers, almost all of which were leaking, and most of which didn't come into service until 1941,
right.
The British surrender land for air and naval bases in British colonial possessions in the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, something which Roosevelt describes as the greatest addition to the defense of the United States since the Louisiana Purchase. So it's a completely inequitable deal.
Right, absolutely.
And then after that, you've got Lend-Lease. And on the one hand, Lend-Lease is a massive deal. It is a declaration of economic warfare by the Roosevelt administration. And it would make an inestimable contribution to Allied victory. Some $10 billion worth of US goods would cross the Atlantic during the Second World War and aid not just the British war effort, but also the Soviet war effort. But again, it came at a price. Before Congress was prepared to pass the Lend-Lease bill, Britain had to denude herself of all of her liquid assets, her gold and her dollars. And while America wasn't in the war, FDR didn't think twice about sending a US cruise ship to South Africa to collect $42 billion worth of Britain's last remaining gold reserves. British companies in the US were sold at half their actual value. And the British had to give a pledge that in return, not only would Lend-Lease be repaid, and by the way, the British government only finished repaying their Second World War debts in 2006.
Right.
But that at the end of the war, they would dissolve the system of tariffs that had protected the British Empire. So it came at a very, very, very heavy cost. But this was the price of survival.
With the Venmo debit card, you can Venmo everything. Your favorite band's merch? You can Venmo this. Or their next show? You can Venmo that. Visit Venmo.me/debit to learn more. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. pursuant to license by MasterCard International Incorporated. Card may be used everywhere MasterCard is accepted. Venmo purchase restrictions apply.
Well, you bring up a couple of good points because there's no point in arguing about post-war the empire if it's not there. So again, we have to survive now. So you make a deal with the devil. You give whatever you can or whatever you have to. But the other point is, another point is the British obviously know what they're doing when it comes to politics. They are very subtle. They're very good at it. Leaking that FDR would not give the destroyers. How could that not generate sympathy? Again, that was a very, very good move. But as far as the uneven trade that you just mentioned, war is war. But business is business, and you got the Great Depression. I mean, I don't want to be crude, but was it like FDR going for all the money that he could, or is that reading too much into it? Or was it just the price of doing business? I
think it's reading a little bit too much into it. There are two things here. So the American view of the British Empire was not very accurate.
Okay.
The Americans thought that the British Empire was much more exploitative than it actually was. I'm not saying that it wasn't exploitative, but the Americans thought that Britain was extremely rich, and therefore it could afford its own defense. And it had to be proven that Britain was really broke. So sending the cruise ships, selling British companies, this was a demonstration to US and congressional opinion that Britain really was broke. So part of it was in order to placate the administration's domestic critics who could otherwise say, well, why are we bailing out Britain? They've got this huge empire, surely they're fine. And it really humiliated the British that the US Treasury demanded before Lend-Lease that the British Treasury open its books to them. They just saying, we're not going to take your word for it that you're broke. We want to see the accounts. And that hurt British pride considerably. I think we do have to, however, remember that throughout the war, and indeed into the early part of the Cold War, it was the British Empire that was the largest commercial rival to the US, not the Soviets. And if we look at the deals that were done, the deal for Lend-Lease to Britain I've already outlined, but the deal for Lend-Lease to the Soviets came with neither expectations of repayment,
right, or
any quid pro quo. Nothing in return was expected. There was no political deal, and if you look at the Bretton Woods agreement on the post-war financial order, the Soviets were given much more favorable terms than the British. And part of that is to do with the fact that the man who was organizing it, Harry Dexter White, who was effectively US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau's right-hand man, was a Soviet agent. But it's also to do with the fact that the Soviets may be a rival geopolitically, but they're not an economic rival to the US, whereas the British Empire is. And it was a long-standing war aim of the Roosevelt administration, as it had been an aim of the Roosevelt administration before the war, to seriously weaken the British Empire and particularly break up its commercial monopoly.
Right. And all of that is another way of saying all politics are local. Like, we'll help you, but if we can get something out of this short term and long term, why wouldn't we? Again, it's just the reality of governments and how humans react. So, yeah, no, it sounds brutal, but things like that happen all the time. So the war is going on. It's not going very well for the Allies. America is not yet in the war, and they're literally, figuratively, in every other way, is Spain, right on the cusp. Franco's thinking about getting in. The location of Spain is obviously very important to Atlantic trade. And as Basil Littlehart said, a friendly Spain was desirable, but a neutral Spain was vital to the Allied cause. But when and that I all knew, but then I got to the part of your book where the various British efforts to keep Spain neutral. There was a lot of carrots and there was a lot of sticks. So would it be going too far to say that Britain's actions, Britain's policies and decisions were vital to keeping Franco just short of saying, yes, I want to jump into this war?
I think it would be overstating it to say that Britain's actions were the determining factor. The determining factor was that Spain was broke, that it had had 3 years of civil war, and it had nothing to go to war with. That was one. And secondly, because Franco dithered, he didn't do what Mussolini did and jump in because he thought that the Germans had won. He dithered, and then he saw the Battle of Britain. And suddenly it's, oh, well, hang on, maybe the Germans aren't going to win quite so easily. I think he continued to believe that Germany would win the war right up until maybe Stalingrad. But if it's not going to be a quick victory, Spain can't afford to be in. He kept on saying that Spain could only afford to come into the war at the hour of the last cartridges, the last shells, and suddenly claim that. But I think the British diplomacy, it helped to a certain extent. Most of Franco's entourage were anti-intervention, and we don't know how much they were influenced by this or not, but the British were bribing them to be anti-intervention. But probably more important, the British were the only power that could really supply Spain with the essential grain and oil it needed to keep its economy going, to keep the population from starving, to keep the Civil War from reigniting. And Franco was made to realize this quite strongly by British diplomacy and a subtle policy of carrot, of letting some goods through the British blockade into Spain on the condition that they weren't then re-exported to Nazi Germany, was an incentive for him to keep on side with Britain.
Gotcha. So yeah, just that little extra British effort. I just found this part of the book very fascinating. And when I was reading about this part, for some reason, it took me back to the Battle of Britain. And we don't have to win. We just have to not lose. And if we can just keep on not losing long enough, then the dynamics could change, and they did change. And we'll get to some of that. And I just love that. Yeah, I just have to hold you at bay for long enough. So anyways, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. There's a title, there's a chapter in your book titled "The Greek Tragedy," and to me, it certainly was that. And I've went deep into the North African campaign. So finally, the British have some good news. You've got General Wavell, you've got Operation Compass. General Richard O'Connor is pushing the Italians out of Egypt. They're pushing them 100 miles back west. Finally, we have something to cheer about. And then comes the threat to Greece. And I'm going to ask you to explain this to me, but does London or does the UK have besides the military, do they have a moral obligation? What was the reason? Because you've got this war in North Africa going well. Suddenly London's pulling troops from it to send to Greece. It's not enough to keep the Italians away, and it's not enough to save Greece. I don't know if they knew that or not, but they make the effort. And I'm just trying to understand why they kind of not dismantled a winning campaign, but what they did do to try to help Greece. I guess that they felt they just needed, or were they obligated, or I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I think they did dismantle a winning campaign in the desert. But this is what's so fascinating, and this is one of the major themes of my book. It is the antagonism between military expediency and politics, and that this is absolutely at the heart of the Greek tragedy, as I call it. As you say, the British have finally got the Italians on the run in Libya. There is a genuine opportunity to clear the Italians, the Germans haven't yet arrived, out of Africa altogether. But then the threats to Greece, which the Italians have invaded in late October of 1940 and have been defeated comprehensively by the Greeks, and the sense that Hitler is about to come to their aid, that is the Italian aid, and that Britain must do something about this. Why must Britain do something about this? It is because in the spring of 1939, Neville Chamberlain, along with guaranteeing Poland, therefore the cause of the Second World War, the British government had guaranteed both Greece and Romania. And Britain's word has to be its bond. And this has to be done for a variety of reasons. Firstly, it just cannot be said that Britain has become so powerless that it can't help a minor Balkan ally. This is the center of a global empire, and it is, despite what people might think, it is not an empire actually run by bayonets and a large standing army in all of its corners. It's run on a sense of prestige and on a sense of power and on a sense of honor. And if suddenly Britain is seen to be acting dishonorably, if Britain is seen to be so powerless that it cannot even help its Greek ally, how can it possibly hope to hold India if war breaks out in the Far East? How can it hope to administer its colonies in both the Caribbean and Africa and all over the world? And then also there is this great sense of the Greek people are an underdog. They've been invaded without any provocation. And this is something which Britain had foreseen, and Britain had promised to defend them. And Britain must keep this promise to be seen to be doing the right thing in America as well. All eyes are always on America. The constant question British policy makers are asking themselves is, how will this play in America?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I was raised in a military family, and one of the things that was drilled into our heads early on was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so that, which is pretty much what happens at this point with the war in North Africa. But you're right, there are so many other bigger questions than just a localized military situation. There's our word, there's our bond, the moral code. I get that. It's just one of those very unfortunate moments of many during World War II. So you've got that going on, and then you've got the mysterious, the complex juggernaut in the East. You've got Soviet Russia. Of course, Churchill for years, decades, has said horrible things about Soviet Russia, not great things about Stalin, but then comes Operation Barbarossa, and you can not like each other all you want, but suddenly you have a same enemy, you're both threatened. It kind of clarifies the situation. But I did want to ask, before June 22nd, 1941, what was London's, to me, I don't know, murky idea about communism, about Stalin, about Soviet Russia? And then how did that kind of change after they started working together post Operation Barbarossa?
So the big question in London, but also in Washington, was what is behind this Nazi-Soviet pact that was concluded in August of 1939? Is it, well, it's obviously not a non-aggression pact, because it was followed by first the German invasion of Poland and then the Soviet invasion of Poland. I mean, it's a non-aggression pact between the two of them, although that is broken on the 22nd of June, 1941. The Soviet Union then invades Finland. It annexes the Baltic states. It annexes eastern Romania. The extent to which the Soviets and the Germans are working hand in glove is constantly debated in London. And the British and the French come perilously close to declaring war or becoming involved in a war with the Soviet Union in the winter of 1939-1940. They contemplate sending an expeditionary force to the Baltic, which would try and protect Finland or try and aid the Finns, which may well have led to a full-blown war with the USSR. And they draw up plans and conduct reconnaissance flights over the Soviet oil fields in Baku, which they are right in saying are oil fields which are helping supply the Third Reich, although the major oil fields which the Reich depends on are actually in Romania. So there's constant bafflement, and there's a constant attempt to try and detach the Soviet bear from the German wolf. But all of this is unsuccessful. The shipments of raw materials which Stalin is sending the Reich continue right up to the eve of Barbarossa. Stalin doesn't believe the warnings that Churchill gives him about the imminent German invasion. He thinks that the British are trying to trick him. They're trying to trick him into doing something which will cause Hitler to attack him. So that's the situation before the 22nd of June.
The McDonald's snack wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch snack wrap. Spicy snack wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
That's incredible. Yeah. And so, and again, going back to something you said a minute ago, and you touch on it again at the end of your book, when the Americans start sending aid to Russia, there's no strings attached, whereas Churchill had to jump through hoops. So anyway, so they're going to start working. Britain and America are going to start sending aid to Soviet Russia, which helps them get through, as horrible as it was, the first year or the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa. So again, the partnership has started. It's certainly rocky. There's still a lot of untrust based on some very good reasons, but the relationship has started. And then comes Pearl Harbor. And as you say in your book, you quote Churchill, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. But again, that doesn't change that the relationship between Washington and London is complex. Then there's the inevitable, and I wanted you to touch on this for me, the inevitable, maybe it wasn't inevitable, but it probably was, with America coming into the war actively and with our industrial base and our the money and the population, it seems it is inevitable that Americans are going to take over. They're going to take control of the Western allies. And I'm sure Churchill didn't want to release that, but that's the reality of the situation. But if you could kind of describe that transition for us as they go along and as they gear up, they get better, but also there's a changing of the guard, if you will.
There is, but it doesn't happen immediately.
Right.
Because it's actually not until 1 month after D-Day that the US has more forces fighting in Europe than the British Commonwealth does. And that beforehand has given Britain as much to say as anyone. And Churchill's interest in military affairs far outstrips FDR's.
Right.
Churchill's obviously gets a lot of things wrong militarily, but he's fascinated by everything militarily. And it is the British strategy, first of Germany first. We must fight Germany first, even though you've been attacked at Pearl Harbor, which is adopted. And FDR very commendably overrules his own chiefs of staff, who continually want to put more and more resources into the Pacific, and says, no, it's Germany first. And then it's the British strategy, or rather Churchill's strategy, to try and pick away at the Axis in the Mediterranean and knock Italy out of the war, clear the Axis from North Africa before a cross-channel attack that is also adopted. And that is done despite the fact that the US Chiefs of Staff want to cross the channel straight away, something which I don't think any military historian thinks was viable, despite the fact that Stalin wants the Western powers to cross the channel straight away. And it's only really at the Tehran conference, when the big three come together for the first time in November of 1943. They've had Operation Torch. They've cleared the Axis from North Africa. They have invaded Sicily and southern Italy. And the British, Churchill in particular, are still very keen on more Mediterranean operations for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to go into if you'd like. But the Americans and the Soviets say enough. And Churchill is really horrified by the way that FDR lines up with Stalin against the British at Tehran, not just on the Second Front, but on a whole range of other issues, including post-war issues. And this is a changing of the guard. It's FDR's assuming of the leadership of the coalition, particularly the western part of the coalition, and thereafter the big three starts to become more and more the big 2.5.
Sorry. I never thought of it that way. But that's brutally honest. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you to give us a little bit more about the Mediterranean, because as much as I admire Churchill, he was a military adventurist. I'm not sure if that's going too far, but he was more involved than he probably could have been, should have been. He did make mistakes, but here it seems to me that he got it right, because the more resources you put into the Mediterranean, the more options you have. You can thrust in different directions, and that is a good thing for you, and it's a harder thing for your enemy to defend. Stalin either didn't or couldn't see that. He just wanted a massive Allied Western army in France, meet me, in Berlin. But if you could explain that a little bit more, because clearly Stalin didn't get it, and I'm guessing the Americans didn't want to get it.
You're completely right. It all comes down to different views of risk. Stalin doesn't care about Soviet bodies. It's not just that there are many, 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 many more German divisions on the Eastern Front and the furious nature of the fighting there and the massacres committed that account for the extraordinary number of casualties. It's also because Stalin treats his armies with callous disregard, and they are sent in wave after wave into strongly defended positions. The British and the Americans aren't like that, but the Americans and Roosevelt are more gung-ho than Churchill is. Britain has been fighting for longer. Britain has experienced defeats. Britain has experienced evacuations. Norway, Dunkirk, southern France, Greece. Churchill says before Operation Torch, the first Anglo-American joint operation, the invasion of French North Africa, if this fails, I will have to resign. He can't announce more evacuations. So he's very, very nervous about an amphibious operation to invade northern France. The Dieppe raid, which the British and the Canadians made on the port of Dieppe in August of 1942 was a disaster, leading to the majority of the participants in the raid being annihilated. And it has always been a long-held sort of view of British strategy that you try and chip away at the enemy. And Churchill obviously had this view in the First World War. That's hence the Gallipoli idea. You chip away at the enemy before you go for the jugular. Whereas the American view of strategy was you go straight for the jugular. And the Americans were right. You did have to do that. And they were right about it in 1944. But they weren't necessarily right about it beforehand. The only final two things I would say are, one, Churchill was very aware that it was predominantly British forces or British Commonwealth forces that were in the Mediterranean, and therefore the more that they could be employed, the more influence he would have in Allied councils, whereas he was aware that the main body of troops that would take part in the invasion of France and therefore of Germany and Western Europe would eventually be American, and that would redound to Britain's disadvantage in Allied discussions. And there was also, towards the later stages of the war, an idea that Mediterranean operations could get the Western powers into Central and Eastern Europe and so forestall the Red Army, the Soviets, the communists from getting there first.
Right, because you do a great job in your book. As the war starts to wind down and they're getting closer and closer to Berlin, Stalin, being Stalin, is already making moves to make sure that Poland is going to be his. It doesn't matter the window dressing. He is going to control that territory. And on one hand, you can't blame him because this is the second time, enemies have come through Poland to attack Russian territory. So on one hand, he's thinking about the future. But you can already see by late 33, 43, early 44, certainly late 44, that they've already got their eye on the post-war world, and they're already making their moves. America financially, Soviet Union territorially, and Britain's just trying to hang on. And I love the 2.5. That was hilarious. By the way, I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for this book. This is my last question. So overall, how would you rate the Grand Alliance? I mean, on one hand, yes, they won, but there was a lot of moving parts to it. But given all of your research, were you surprised, or should we be surprised, how quickly this Grand Alliance falls apart as soon as the war is over, as soon as they don't have a common enemy? They kind of revert back to what they were. And it just, I don't know, did it shock the world that this thing just fell apart so quickly after the war?
I don't think it should come as a surprise. Mm-hmm. It wasn't inevitable, but it wasn't at all surprising.
Right.
The British and the Americans were liberal democracies that had started to fight. Well, the British had chosen to fight. The Americans fought after they had been attacked for a rules-based international order as opposed to the law of the jungle, for the rights of small nations, for democracy, for liberty, for self-determination. The Soviet Union was an aggressive, totalitarian dictatorship that didn't give a fig for the rights of small nations or democracy or liberty, and believed that the point of states along its fringes was to be dominated by it, was to be a security cordon for it. So I don't think it is that surprising. I think what is more surprising is that both the British and, I'm afraid to a greater extent, the Americans, and particularly Roosevelt, failed to realize the expansionist aims of Joseph Stalin before the end of the war, or kidded themselves about it. They like to say, well, nothing will be decided until the peace conference. But, well, actually, things are really going to be decided by who's on the ground when the music stops. And Stalin's willingness to talk about democracy at Yalta, to talk about a free and independent Poland, was so at odds with the reality on the ground and the reality of his rule in other Eastern European states, either before the war or after these states were being liberated from the Germans, that I think it is surprising that the Americans were so slow to wake up to this threat, and how they failed to concert a joint strategy with the British earlier for combating it.
Right. And you touch on this in your book. You just reminded me of this. FDR can be a brilliant politician, win 4 elections in the United States, but on the international stage, it's a different game. And Stalin, and one of the things I picked up from or I was reminded of in your book about Stalin, he doesn't do anything he doesn't want to do, anything he doesn't have to do. And if he's certainly not going to get anything out of it, I mean, he's a zero-sum kind of thinker. But you're absolutely right. I think FDR's powers of charm, persuasion, did not translate in the way that he thought it would.
Absolutely. And it's not just FDR. Churchill thought the same, but Churchill also had great moments of doubt, whereas FDR had fewer moments of doubt. FDR is one of the most successful, impressive politicians of the 20th century. He was easily the best politician of the big 3. And he had rarely found a challenge within America that he couldn't overcome. And my God, he faced more challenges than any US president in history. And he was incredibly persuasive. He was a very adept politician. But he felt that his sort of folksy charm, he felt that his vagueness, he felt that all of this could work in the international sphere. And it could work with a supplicant like Churchill, but it couldn't work with as one British diplomat called it, a Caucasian bandit, that is Joseph Stalin, who, and I finished quote from this diplomat, whose only thought when he got something for nothing was that the other fellow was an ass.
Stalin saw the world in a very different way. And I think I will leave it there. Mr. Bouverie, thank you for your time. We have left so much out. And for those who have read a whole bunch of World War II books or listened to a podcast, the details that you bring in this, it was a pleasure to discover so many new things. So I certainly appreciate that. For everybody out there, the book is Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World. Mr. Bouverie, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. It's a great pleasure.
If you can't pronounce it, why drink it? Other plant-based milks are loaded with gums, oils, and mystery ingredients. Malk keeps it simple. With simple ingredients you can count on one hand. No gums, oils, fillers, or anything else you can't pronounce. Visit malkorganics.com to find Malk near you. Taste the difference today.
What if you could actually hear what your employees are thinking and use that insight to keep them engaged, growing, and committed long-term? At People Element, we help you do just that. With simple, powerful employee surveys and expert guidance, you'll uncover the data that drives better culture, leadership, and retention. Visit peopleelement.com and discover how better listening leads to better workplaces.